I'm very glad to be here among you on this weekend. So I will, without further ado, then I will just jump into my topic, Beyond the Hype, Buddhism at the Risk of Neuroscience, and you'll see what I mean by that very soon. Until now, Buddhism has played a rather passive role in its so-called dialogue with neuroscience. While a wide array of scientists have been called to witness, the Buddhist sample has been limited to a certain type of Buddhist modernism centered on philosophy and meditation. With regard to philosophy, the emphasis has been on certain trends or schools like Abhidharma, Madhyamika, and more recently Yogacara, and certain approaches, epistemology, rather than ontology or metaphysics. With respect to meditation, the emphasis has been on mindfulness at the expense of ritual, myth, devotion, visionary experience, and a few other things. If Buddhism is going to meet the challenge, a very real one, posed by science and more especially neuroscience, it is time to invite new interlocutors at the table and to summon what Stephen Jay Gould would call the full house, that is, to represent Buddhism, warts and all. Now let me start with a few caveats. First and foremost, I have no authority to speak in the name of something called Buddhism, although I do that all the time. All I can say is that the Buddhism I have found in my studies is very different from the clear idea of Buddhist philosophy and meditation that I started from more than 30 years ago. Recently, scholars have come to speak of Buddhism in the plural, yet they still speak of a Buddha as in the singular, and usually they claim to have special access to that Buddha's mind. Even those, particularly those, who want to argue for an evolving Dharma and put Buddhism in the naturalistic framework of Darwinian evolution theory, somehow can't let go of the foundational myth of Buddhism. Although, as Donald Lopez nicely put it, one of my colleagues, Donald Lopez, in his recent book, their Buddha is no longer the old guy of traditional Buddhism, but a new scientific Buddha. Some things don't change, or at least have not changed since the 19th century. The second caveat regards the interpretation of neuroscientific data on meditation. And here I'll want to show you a few slides, if I can. Yeah. Here is someone you may know. I mean, there's a French practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism and a translator of the Dalai Lama, very popular. He's published recently a huge book on Buddhism and happiness and various other books, altruism and so on and so forth. So he's been one of the spokesmen for the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism. And it's based on experiments done on him by neuroscientists who are also kind of trained or who are also, let's say, students, disciples of the Dalai Lama. So based on his experiment that they found on a one-person experiment, really, it was found that somehow his frontal cortex, the left part of the frontal cortex, was slightly thicker than the ordinary person, and that part of the cortex was connected to good feelings and so on. So therefore, the equation between Buddhism and happiness was made, and with some reservations probably on the part of the scientists, but this really became the headlines of, and you might have read this, Buddhism is as the gate to happiness. So basically, this all rested on this, at first on this one experience. They tried to do some experiments with Tibetan practitioners, but they found, of course, that the communication skills were not exactly as good, so they preferred to turn to someone who could communicate it better in English. It would be like, like looking for the flash, under the lamppost for the key you have lost, rather in the dark where you might actually have lost it anyway. So, and this image has been really very, very widespread. Now, I also have been the subject of some experiment 2 years ago, and yeah, so there was based on a slightly different model. I mean, the so-called the diffusion intention imaging instead of the traditional board, signal imaging that's been the main technique used for fMRI in the past. So that was very impressive to me. I mean, the friend neuroscientist put me into his experiment, and the experiment was about olfaction. And I have actually practically no sense of olfaction, so they would put some scent, some smell under my nose, and I don't feel anything. But he told me that that it didn't matter. What they were interested in was my basic brain function, and the smell part was just a side issue there. So we get up, I get this many pages report, and you cannot see too well, but all these lines are actually functions of the brain. So 404 functions, which is actually based on the Buddhist symbolism there. And so all kinds of functions, from the simplest one to, let's say, motor functions to broader functions like empathy and things like that. I'm going to show just a few of them to show you where my question lies. I was very impressed by the technique, the technology. It's incredibly powerful. I was less impressed by the interpretation of these things. And I discussed this with my friend, and every time he had a very good answer, but I felt like it's more like divination almost, like tarot cards. So here, for example, it's like tongue movement perceptions. And so so it's based on areas of the brain that are connecting, right? Well, not just the part that are really active, but the various areas connecting. So you can see my brain is connecting well. I guess probably normally, I would say, right? I'm not a very skillful person. I drop things all the time, but that doesn't seem too bad. Happiness, well, I'm a fairly, reasonably happy person, so I thought, okay, that's, the bigger the green part, right, the more important the function is, right, the activity. Harmony, well, that surprised me. I'm not too harmonious, but in any case. And here again, how do you define harmony? My question started there, What does it mean, harmony? Reasoning, that really shocked me. I'm kind of a philosopher, right? I think I have a good, critical mind. And I thought, it gave me pause here. Well, it's getting worse. Religious feeling, well, I'm teaching religious studies, so that's all right, that's fine. I'm not a believer myself, really. I don't belong to, I've been raised in Christian, in Catholicism, but I'm not a practitioner, not even Buddhist. My practice is meditation, but okay, that could make sense for a scholar in religious studies. Now, that again, self-reflection, I'm brain dead. Now, this might be true. Wendy can probably testify to that, so I won't, Humor appreciation, now also that hurts me. Right? I thought I have a fairly good sense of humor, not a great one, but at least, well, I'm French. So that I was really, say something went wrong. But wait, came then humor comprehension. And look at this suddenly, now, humor, well, okay, what was it? Humor appreciation and humor comprehension, I'm not sure I understand the difference and why in one case I would be so brain dead and the other I would be so relatively active, right? So, and that one too, irony processing, how different is it? And so I felt better, but I still then, it really raised my question as to how you interpret this in this particular way. How can we trust this kind of result, right? So, worry, well, I'm kind of a worrying type, I guess. Maybe not, I don't know. But anyway, that shows you a little bit what the kind of questions I might have there. So in his seminal work on the history and philosophy of science, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn famously made the case that what scientists observe and how they observe it is already tied up with the paradigmatic assumptions that frame their whole endeavor. The neuroscientific paradigm is not the same as Buddhism, as the Buddhist paradigm, and in spite of all declarations to the contrary, it is in fact at odds with it. Neuroscientists cannot have access to what the Buddhist practitioner is actually experiencing, the so-called qualia of meditation, right? The way it feels, what you feel when you perceive things or experience things. And they cannot help interpreting the practitioner's account in their own terms, according to scientific presuppositions that leave no room for an authentic Buddhist experience. Their observations are far from neutral, inasmuch as they confirm a Western way of thinking that denies the reality of the Buddhist worldview. At a more technical level, measurements of a meditation practitioner's brain lead to unresolved questions about their meaning. What exactly do an increase of prefrontal activity or cortex thickness, an increase of gamma rays and the like mean? Changes in brainwave patterns and such during practice tell us nothing about the experience itself, let alone about its value for the practitioner. Even as data, the data are often problematic. EEGs and fMRIs may provide a wealth of data, but these are actually inconclusive. Neuroplasticity is not, or should not be, an end in itself, and it remains meaningless unless a clear goal is defined. All measurements are not equal, and neither are the data resulting from them. You can measure anything you like, of course, but solid experimental data cannot simply be the result of new scanning techniques. They must be a response to well-asked questions that justify specific measurements. Unless these conditions are met, experiments obey a blind logic of accumulation instead of being creative in such a case. In such a case, all observations are equal and equally arbitrary, recorded in the hope that some distant day they may somehow make sense. In this respect, one cannot fail to be struck by how dependably the interpretations of the data on meditation, buoyed by a lot of wishful thinking, are put in the conditional tense. An increase of the gamma rays might mean this or that, right? So the scientists are always careful to use the conditional, while the scientific journalists are not. They re-jump to the affirmative point. Now, a third caveat about Neo-Buddhism. So here a third caveat is in order about regarding Buddhist modernism, or what I call in the plural Neo-Buddhism. Because the most recent of them claim to be postmodern, or even zeitgeist obliges, trans or post-human. So we are moving away from modernism here. Was not the Buddha, after all, the first post-human? Among Buddhist modernists, we must distinguish between Asian and Western types, with a few figures like the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh serving as intermediaries. The question of Buddhist modernism has been well treated by David McMahon, and I need not dwell on it here. The adaptation of Buddhism to the modern and postmodern worlds has been seen as a further chapter in the long history of Buddhism. According to Neo-Buddhists, Buddhism always managed to adapt to new societies. In their view, the moment has come for it not only to adapt to, but to embrace the postmodern technological world. This is, for instance, the view of a group calling themselves the Buddhist Geeks. As Linda Heumann, a journalist for Journal Tricycle, and others have pointed out, the task might be much harder this time because of the radically new reality into which we find ourselves thrown, with rapid digitalization of our lives, the convergence of the technologies, the so-called NBIC, nanotechnologies, biotechnologies, information technologies, and cognitive science, with the so-called singularity, transhumanism or posthumanism on the horizon of the mid-21st century, but also the convergence of the so-called GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and now there's a fifth one, I forgot now, and their Asian counterpart. So this raises the bar very high for Buddhism. Will the posthuman envisioned by the prophets of transhumanism still have anything to do with the Buddhist vision of the true human life? Have the cyborgs a Buddha nature? Or will they be able to reverse engineer one? The Croatian philosopher Slavoj Žižek has argued that Buddhism is the ideology of neo-capitalism. His criticism applies to the mindfulness movement and even more to its non-Buddhist, secularized, sugar-coated version, the so-called MBSR, or mindfulness-based stress reduction. I'm sure I'm going to offend a few here, but anyway, please bear with me. But equally to neo-Buddhist movements, the Buddhist geeks, for instance, see themselves as hackers, taking from the Buddhist tradition whatever they like. They define themselves in generational terms, in opposition to baby boomers, baby boomer Buddhists, people of my age, right? And show little or no interest in non-Western Buddhism. They are, as it were, reinventing the Dharma wheel. Bernard Stiegler, a French philosopher, has recently argued that the hacker mentality contributed to what he calls the disruption, the destruction of traditional social relationships by marketing and the algorithm of the big data. He analyzes the reticular evolution of postmodern society as tending toward totalization, if not totalitarianism, or functional stupidity. So this brings me to my fourth and last caveat regarding mindfulness. Mindfulness, as you know, is everywhere. It has become the new mindless mantra. From a critical point of view, mindfulness seems to meet a need, and many have argued that from a clinical standpoint, any addition to the arsenal of techniques that could help fight depression and similar psychological disorders should be welcome. It is hard to argue against the argument that mindfulness alleviates suffering, even if it is possibly in the way of a placebo. All right. The instrumentalization, well, let me show you a few more slides then. That's the founder of the MBSR movement, as you probably know, John Kabat-Zinn. So he was himself, he's a clinician, and he has written extensively on mindfulness. He was first on the board of the Mind and Life Institute, right, around the Dalai Lama. So for a long time he has been drawing on Buddhist notions of meditation. Now he claims, and others have claimed, that actually mindfulness doesn't need Buddhism anymore. For a long time, having said, the importance of mindfulness is the fact that we have 25 centuries of Buddhist meditation behind it. Now suddenly that mindfulness is standing alone, Buddhism is no longer really needed as a way, because he thinks obviously that the religious aspect of Buddhism might detract a few more followers. And then you have all these mindfulness apps, right? As I came, in New York, there's a day in the subway, I was looking at this app for one of these advertising for one of these apps, saying, okay, what if instead of counting your likes on Facebook, you use this app to practice meditation? And I thought, instead, isn't it the same thing? Because if you are using your iPhone I'm not sure I see a difference there. So you have more than 1,000 new apps now, right, to practice meditation. And then you have all these advertising, you know, apps for iPhone, mind apps, I forget, it is a mobile, I read it if you cannot, right? It's a mobile wireless internet device. You can follow your bliss and the score of the game, right? So, okay, it's kind of a, follow your bliss. The obstacle is the past. If you aim for it, you are turning away from it. This is a Zen GPS. So, one of the most successful apps is called Headspace. And so that's what it looks like. You know, choose an exercise to help regain a calm mind, SOS, touch. Please place your fingertips here for 30 seconds, and obviously you get some kind of insight or I know, some concentration. I've not used it, so I cannot really, I should not be making fun of it, but I do. Stop, breathe, and think, right? And yeah. Well, okay. So, and you see, of course, on these ads, you always see really nice young people, usually nice young women, right? On the place, well, here in bed, okay, why in bed? Or on the beach, right, with a beautiful sunset in the background. So, of course, I mean, it's very, you know, and you have this position, like you have seen that, right? Which has nothing to do with Buddhism. There's no Buddhist meditation using this, right? It's really derived from yoga, actually. But that's really what you see everywhere, right? Look at this guy, right? On his desk. Corporate mindfulness. Right, you see. You can take a break in the midst of a meeting, right? You should try this here at Calgary University at the next faculty meeting, Wendy. All right, and so the guy would, the app that I mentioned before was created by this guy, Andy Puddicombe, and he had this, collective meditation, mindfulness session in the midst of Manhattan here. And you can also do that in the gym, right? So, okay, and then you have the so-called mindfulness. I love monks. All right. So, the instrumentalization of mindfulness outside the clinical domain has been noted by Ronald Purser and David Lewis. Purser and Lewis have criticized what they call mindfulness, the trivialization of meditation and its use by corporations and by the military. Let me simply add that the Mac of mindfulness should not simply refer to McDonaldization, but as I just showed, to Mac computers and similar devices, iPad, iPhone, etc., we are using every day. When I open my applications, I find various advertisements for mindfulness brought to me by corporate companies like Forbes, for instance. They give me pause, right? Forbes is interested in my spiritual progress. That's good. To give just a few examples, how to be mindful at a stoplight, how to be mindful with a cup of coffee, or while brushing your teeth. For Wendy, I would mention how to be mindful when you're looking for a parking lot. All right. Oh, sorry, that's private joke here. Not to mention the 1,000+ apps available for mindfulness I just showed. Mindfulness.com, mindfulness ad nauseam. Clearly, we have moved beyond the clinical level here. We are confronted with an epidemic. With this kind of sweetened, Nutella-like meditation, we have entered the virtual reality of consumerist society and neo-capitalism. How mindfulness could be so easily recuperated by mindless consumerism raises a lot of urgent questions. The claim that marketing devices and techniques aimed at capturing consumers' attention could lead to more awareness is, to say the least, paradoxical. For better or worse, we are trapped in the world of doxa.com. Here I am reminded of a sign that I recently saw on the Yale campus. It said, "Stop texting, pay attention to your real life." Your real life surroundings, actually, unquote. It shows a new awareness of the impoverishment of our lives created by the new technologies. But where is our real life? In a world of simulacra, where the media have become our surroundings and our inner content or discontent. If there is something that scientific experiments on consciousness, for instance, those on change blindness, have taught us, it is that our attention is very limited. Here again, that try to find a parking lot when some French guy is talking next to you, right? You realize how limited your attention can be. Actually, focused attention may be the reason of change blindness. It is what, for instance, allows a gorilla to become invisible on a basketball ground, and perhaps in a classroom. You know this experiment of the gorilla, right? You must all have seen it by now, right? Where people are playing basket and you are supposed to count how many, time they pass the ball, and so they count really. And at the end of the experiment, you ask them, what about, they tell you, 25 times, okay, good. But what about the gorilla? Which gorilla? And then you replay the thing, and then clearly enough, sure enough, in the middle of the game, you see a guy, this guy is a gorilla coming, waving at you, and so no, the people would usually say, no, that can't be true. This is a false, No, you really can show that they were so focused on one thing that you didn't see the other, the obvious one, the elephant, the gorilla in the room, right? In the classroom in this case. So, conversely, diffuse attention is also achieved at the detriment of focus. If you become conscious of your interlocutor's face or behavior, you may lose sight or hearing of what he or she is trying to say. Likewise, a psychoanalyst trying to understand the latent meaning of her client's words might miss their manifest meaning. We are reminded here of Wittgenstein's duck-rabbit picture. We either see a duck or a rabbit. You have seen this picture? Is this something that you're familiar with, right? Yeah, so basically you see a rabbit, and then after a while you might see it actually a duck, and vice versa. But you cannot see both at the same time. Introspection, you either see a duck or rabbit at a given moment. Introspection is usually achieved at the expense of extraspection, or more generally, inspection, relying on visual metaphor, at the expense of other senses. Thus, one may wonder if, to paraphrase La Fontaine's fable, the frog of consciousness has much to gain by trying to make itself as large as the ox of the unconscious. The limitations of our consciousness, attention and the rest, may have their raison d'être from the evolutionary standpoint, even if, from a Buddhist standpoint, consciousness may simply be a dangerous supplement. At any rate, contemplative science does not exist yet, contrary to what we are being told. It is not what the Buddhists, not to mention the Buddha, were doing. It might, however, become possible, judging from the current work of phenomenologically inspired scientists such as Claire Petit-Mangin. Yet this kind of first-person science, inspired by Francisco Varela's neurophenomenology, is still part of the attempt to naturalize meditation, and it is quite distinct from traditional Buddhism. I now turn to the question of naturalizing Buddhism. There is no clear distinction, no clear definition of naturalism, but most people would agree that it entails the theory of physical closure. Everything that happens in the world belongs to the realm of nature, even culture. Everything can or should or will eventually, therefore, be understood through a naturalist, that is, a scientific approach. There is therefore no supernatural realm. Apart from its purely scientific meaning, the word naturalizing has other meanings in French that I find germane to my discussion. One naturalizes immigrants, right? And Buddhism seems to qualify for this immigrant status. But one also naturalizes dead animals by stuffing them. And I'm afraid that naturalized Buddhism could become a kind of stuffed Buddhism, stuffed with all kinds of Western notions. In his book on the history of cybernetics, Jean-Pierre Dupuy, a French philosopher at Stanford, described the mechanization of the mind that followed the Macy conferences in the 40s and the 50s. Likewise, Catherine Hayes, in two seminal books, My Mother Was a Computer and How We Became Posthuman, has shown how the computational model of the mind emerged from a problematic reading of Claude Shannon's information theory and became the dominant paradigm. In this way, patterns took precedence over substance, leading to the still prevalent notion, not only among posthumanists and neuroscientists, that the mind could be, as it were, scanned and downloaded on a different platform, brain, body, or machine, just like a software can be used on different types of hardware. As Hilary Putman put it, it could just as well be made of Swiss cheese. Your mind, right, your very precious self could actually have been made not just a biological, matter, but of Swiss cheese, or camembert, maybe, if you prefer. In reaction to this dematerializing tendency, Francisco Varela and others, inspired by the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, have developed a theory known as enaction that insists on the embodiment of the cognition or the mind, embodied mind. There's a book by this title. While the classical model computational theory of the mind, inherited from cybernetics, continues to dominate the hard science, neuroscience in particular, various other models have come to the forefront of the theoretical discussion. The lust for acronyms has led to subsume these new approaches under the formula the 4E: enactive, embodied, embedded, and extended. They share the notion that cognition, or the mind, or consciousness, is not limited to the individual brain. It involves objects, people, and institutions. It is closer to what Bruno Latour calls a network, in which the brain would be only a hub, an important one, admittedly, but perhaps not the central one. So, naturalizing Buddhism means, among other things, first, naturalizing various Buddhist tenets like the Four Noble Truths, the notion of karma, and Buddhist cosmology, and demythologizing the Buddhist tradition. No need of all these legends and stories of wonders and so on. And finally, naturalizing Buddhist consciousness, and in particular mindfulness, as attempted by the various experiments based on EEGs, electroencephalograms, and fMRIs. So, well, I repeat myself here, forgive me. The results obtained by these techniques has been questioned repeatedly, but I won't dwell on this here now. Let me simply say that I recently came across a source mentioning that playing Super Mario develops the frontal cortex, which is also what meditation did to one French practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, leading to the inflated conclusion that meditation is the gate to happiness. I also read that experiences suggest that increased intelligence is related to a thinning, not a thickening, of that cortical area. Who knows? Speaking of half-baked conclusions, another experiment, actually a kind of hoax, has shown that the interesting result obtained by the fMRI of a subject to which photos of facial expression had been shown. The subject, it turned out, was a dead and uncooked salmon. The future of sashimi consciousness remains an open question. William James has an interesting passage on what he calls the medical materialism, the neuroscience of his time. I quote, "Medical materialism finishes up St. Paul by calling his vision on the road to Damascus a discharging lesion of the occipital cortex, he being an epileptic. It snuffs out Saint Teresa as an hysteric, Saint Francis of Assisi as an hereditary degenerate. And it thinks that the spiritual authority of all such personages is successfully undermined," unquote. But he continues, I quote again, "Scientific theories are organically conditioned just as much as religious emotions are." So Well, I let you draw the conclusion there, right? The French neuroscientist Jean-Pierre Changeux, who doesn't seem to have read James, explained away Blaise Pascal's illumination as an epileptic fit. In spite of the title of his first bestseller, The Neuronal Man, he never seems to think that his own scientific philosophy may also be purely neuronal, that is, without much truth value, just like Saint Teresa or Saint Francis. Theological notions. Regarding the cognitive scientific discourse on question of the relation between the mind and the brain, or the emergence of consciousness, the most extreme approach is the so-called eliminativism of Patricia and Paul Churchland, and also the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who simply deny the problem. Thus, Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, should rather have been entitled Consciousness Explained Away. Of course, naturalism need not be that brutal. In a recent book entitled La silhouette de l'humain, the outline, the silhouette of the human, the cognitive philosopher Daniel Handler traces the history of naturalism and its extension to cognitive sciences and evolutionary theory. He argues for a moderate naturalism, one that does not try to explain and explain away everything. Okay. Well, I seem like I'm dropping names here, but forgive me. From another angle, anthropologists and sociologists like Philippe Descola, Viveros de Castro, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, Tim Ingold, and Bruno Latour have discussed the question of naturalism. For Descola and Viveros de Castro, naturalism, while it has become the dominant ideology of Western societies, is only one of the possible models that can be found in Western societies. Descola, in his book Beyond Nature and Culture, described three other such ontologies, which he calls shamanistic, animist, and analogical. In a recent book, Le Gaucher Boiteux, Michel Serres, taking his cue from Descola, argues that while we claim to be naturalist, we also depend to various degrees on shamanistic, animistic, and analogical ontologies. This stands well with Latour, who argues in his book, in a book of the same title, that we have never been modern, and that the theoretical divide between society and nature, which characterizes modernity and science, is in practice constantly belied. Taking his cues from a relatively obscure French philosopher, Étienne Souriau, he calls for an inquiry in various modes of existence, a good number of which are anathema to naturalism. Now, I mentioned briefly a few attempts at naturalizing Buddhism. The eliminativist approach has been taken by Robert Scharf in his discussion of experience. While I usually appreciate Scharf's critical acumen, I think that his endorsement of Dennett's views leads him to overlook various aspects of Asian Buddhism, with which he is quite familiar. Another form of eliminativism on the Western Buddhist side would be the rejection of religious or mystical experience and the reduction of a Buddha's teaching to a few basic tenets. What philosophically minded scholars like Mark Sideritz and Owen Flanagan see as a long overdue purification process, however, others may see as an impoverishment, a form of reductionism. We end up with an utterly demythologized philosophical, in a word, naturalized Buddhism. Strangely, those who want to reduce Buddhism to a philosophy are often the same who show disinterest in its history. At the other end of the spectrum, historians too want to deal with an utterly secular ideological Buddhism. Regarding Buddhist ontology or metaphysics, the main trend has been to deny their importance based on the philosophical works of the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna and on an epistemological reading of Yogacara doctrine. This reading has recently become quite popular through the works of scholars like Dan Arnold or J. Garfield. Yet in East Asia at least, it cannot be denied that the ontological interpretation of Yogacara tenets, such as the three worlds are mind or consciousness only, was also very important at times, but it has been deemed heterodox by Western scholars influenced by the Tibetan orthodoxy. Regarding Buddhist cosmology, the Dalai Lama himself, in an oft-quoted quip, said that he was ready to abandon the outdated aspects of it that have been proved wrong by science. There seems to be here a category mistake, however. The world in which that cosmology obtained is not the naturalistic world of science. It is a world ruled by the law of karma, a law that the Dalai Lama himself is reluctant to discard. For good reasons, indeed, because without the cosmology of the 10 realms and the 6 paths of rebirth, human, animals, etc., the doctrine of karma makes no sense. This is because this cosmology is also a template for the soteriological path, the marga, and for the levels of meditation of dhyana, another item that no Buddhist in his right mind would let go. Buddhism, like a living organism, is not modular, and neither is the brain, we are now told. And while it has a certain plasticity, you cannot remove big chunks of it without creating major malfunctions or perhaps inducing a kind of coma. We might be left with comatose Buddhism. Could we at least dispense with Buddhist mythology? Not without risks. Take, for instance, the Buddha's life, which has been a template for Buddhist practice for centuries. Once you remove all the mythological elements, as historicist scholars have tried to do for generations, you are left with a perfectly uninspiring biography, which boils down to saying that Gautama, the future Buddha, was born, practiced austerities, and reached some kind of spiritual experience in his 30s, and died after a long teaching career. Nothing to write home about. How about gods and demons? Since its rediscovery in the 19th century, Buddhism has been praised as a religion without gods, in spite of all evidence to the contrary. One feeble attempt at naturalizing the gods has been to interpret them as psychological categories, in particular in the case of Tantric or esoteric Buddhism. But this interpretation, which, while also found in some Buddhist texts, contradicts the reality of Buddhist practice. So I'll turn in the last section to what we could call another Buddhist phenomenology. To define Buddhism as a search and above all a quick fix for happiness, eudaimonism for our time is to emasculate it, to forget precisely about its demonic nature. Incidentally, the word eudaimonism, which means really the quest and a theory that leads to a happy life, usually defined as human flourishing, meant in Greek, I quote, having a good daimon dwelling within. Aristotle's daimon might have been a purely good one. Socrates' daimon, as you know, Socrates had the daimon, right? He was listening to the word of his daimon. That led him to accept, death. So Socrates' daimon was a little bit more ambivalent. Buddhism, however, attempts to both good and bad daimons. So the word demons, of course, derived from daimons, but originally daimons were, in Greek, in ancient Greece, daimons were ambivalent. They meant a kind of spiritual force within us. The Buddha, or the text attributed to him, never speak of happiness in the ordinary Western sense. They actually argue that all happiness is intrinsically suffering. The Buddha claims to have found a way to end all suffering, a state he calls nirvana or extinction. Admittedly, in later Mahayana sources, nirvana itself is described as bliss. But the point is, happiness is not to be found in this ordinary, deluded human life. The very search for happiness is a source of suffering for oneself and others. The Buddha was no Aristotle, and no Marcus Aurelius either, not a skeptic or stoic. In spite of those, we want to read him as an Asian stoic. In its Western context, Buddhism, with its alleged emphasis on consciousness, is often paired with phenomenology. Thus, when many philosophers argue for a naturalization of consciousness and phenomenology, it would seem just as natural to want to naturalize Buddhism. But this is not just a philosophical project, a mere matter of agreement or disagreement. It implies the destruction of real aspects of Buddhism, as can be seen, for instance, in the religious policies of China toward Buddhism today. I mean, in the past and even now. And what if consciousness or mindfulness was the problem, not the solution? Perhaps ordinary consciousness is precisely what Buddhism was trying to bracket in a kind of radical epoche bracketing that would make Buddhist philosophy almost irrelevant. Much of Buddhism is a critique of discursive language and discriminative thought. Thus, when we focus exclusively on scholastic discourses like the Abhidharma, for instance, we may be barking up the wrong tree. Yet the opposite tendency, the anti-intellectual approach emphasizing pure experience and immersion in consciousness, was also derided as falling into a dark pit, particularly in Zen or Chan. For Chan Buddhists, at least, what was at stake was no specific conscious mental state, but something of an entirely different order, which they also define as non-thinking, Wunyan or Wuxin in Chinese, or the unlocalized, unconditioned mind. We don't have to take them at their word, but they give us another very different look at Buddhist practice. As is well known, meditation was, in principle at least, strongly rejected by Chan masters like Linji Yishuan, the founder of the Rinzai school of Japanese Zen, even if in practice it was still largely practiced in Chan monasteries. At the other hand of the spectrum, or perhaps it is the same, we find visionary practice. Visions, induced or spontaneous, played a central role in the Pure Land school and in Tantric or esoteric Buddhism. So did possession, again induced or spontaneous. This leads us to examine briefly the question of magic. After all, the vast majority of Buddhist rituals are apotropaic, aimed at warding off evil, or even black magical in nature. Jean-Pierre Dupuy, whom I had already mentioned, entitled one of his books on analytic philosophy, "Have We Forgotten Evil?" This could be the title of many books on Buddhism. Magic and possession, of course, have a bad press in Western scholarship, with perhaps the exception of some anthropologists. But even the latter tend to naturalize them by reducing them to hocus pocus or superstition. Even more so, Buddhist scholars and neo-Buddhist practitioners when dealing with magical Buddhist ritual. Finally, we come to the blind spot in a neuroscientific discussion of Buddhist consciousness: enlightenment, or rather awakening. Without awakening, no Buddha. And without Buddha, no Buddhism worth engaging. Awakening is what Mallarmé would have called the ideal flower itself, the one that is absent from all bouquets. It is the umbilic of Buddhism, the core, the center. Just like Freud spoke of the umbilic of the dreams, the point through which the dream is linked to the unknown. According to the Dalai Lama himself, this exalted state no longer has any neural correlates. This aporetic state, or vanishing point, is of course a conversation breaker for a neuroscientist, although some may argue that it could still be localized on an fMRI, precisely by the conspicuous absence of any signal. Awakening cannot be reduced to the known. because it is the gate to the unknown that is the source of the known. Just like, well, forget that. All right. In praise of difference, and I would say, the attempt to analyze, naturalize Buddhism goes back to the 19th century, and it overlaps with the attempt to engage Buddhist philosophy. Indeed, there are many valuable philosophical components in Buddhism, and they should be attended to. But to reduce Buddhism to a philosophy or a religion or a spirituality or anything is to reduce one type of discourse to another, the latest discourse in vogue being precisely neuroscience. I want to argue here for another approach. Instead of looking desperately for convergence, let us value divergence, difference, in the Derridean sense, with an A rather than an E, right? Differentiating, otherness, the irreducible aspects of Buddhism. The Buddhists to be invited to the table do not have to pass a kind of philosophical version of the Turing test, what I call the Rorty test, after the Richard Rorty, the philosopher. And I quote him, the Chinese, he said, the Kashinahwa and the Martians may have suggestions as to other reforms to introduce, but we should adopt them only, only if they succeed in adjusting to our typically Western socio-democratic aspirations, unquote. Right? So that's Rorty's attempt to meet the other, the unknown. In what Jean-François Lyotard called Rorty's soft or conversational imperialism, most Asian Buddhists, with perhaps the exception of Dalai Lama, would be Chinese, Martians, or Kashinahwas. Rather than activating our mirror neurons, these potential interlocutors should inhibit them and activate instead other neglected areas of our brain or of our extended cognition. They shouldn't be too westernized, but neither should their otherness be idealized, as happens, of course, in the case, of American Indians, for instance. Buddhism offers us a mirror precisely because it presents us with a different image of what it is to be human. It also provides us a much-needed sense of transcendence, a regulating ideal without which human life, utterly naturalized and unidimensional, would become devoid of purpose, lifeless. Naturalizing our minds would mean that we have become, or perhaps always have been, cyborgs or zombies. Early Buddhists call these beings, which look human but have no Buddha nature and can never reach awakening, ichantikas. Mahayana Buddhists, however, claim that all beings, even ichantikas, have a Buddha nature. In other words, there are no ichantika at all. So, paraphrasing Latour, one could perhaps argue that in spite of all talk to the contrary, Buddhism has never been modern. In order to really engage Buddhism, or for Buddhism to really engage a dialogue with neuroscience, this fact has to be clearly recognized. So, in conclusion, where do we go from here? I have offered an all-too-brief survey of various issues I see related to the naturalizing tendency that emerged from the encounter between Buddhism and science over the past century and a half, and ever more massively from the attempts of a dialogue since the 80s. This tendency, combined with the digitalization of our lives that explain in part the current mindfulness hype, confronts Buddhism with radically new challenges and perhaps opportunities. In order to meet these challenges, we need to abandon the notion of a modular Buddhism from which one can pick whatever suits you, and try to get a better view of the full house of Buddhism. This doesn't mean that everything that once defined Buddhism must be kept, but it must at least be acknowledged and, as the case may be, preserved or abandoned in full knowledge of the vital or not so vital role it has played in a tradition. Over its long history, Buddhism has shown a lot of resilience, but its plasticity plasticity is not infinite. We should hesitate to reinvent it from scratch, according to our often simplistic conceptions of what it has been or should be, or according to the totalizing and perhaps pre-totalitarian norms of the new world we have stumbled upon, a transhuman world in which good old-fashioned transhumance, seasonal migration, or nomadism may no longer be possible. How could you still be drifting like cloud in water, an old name for Buddhist monks, when GPS rules? One last look at GPS and other similar devices. Happy with iPad. You can see it's not just a Western phenomenon. It has reached all, it has kind of pizza effect, of course, reach Asia too. So I will leave you with this image seen on Korean TV of an American monk being welcomed at the Seoul airport by his Korean colleagues. When the latter expressed surprise at seeing that he had checked no luggage, a true monk, right, with no possession, he showed them with a big smile his iPad. Enlightenment guaranteed. Thank you. I'll be glad to take questions, of course.
Yes, so we don't have one of those handheld mics, so please speak up with your questions, and I'll sort of kind of keep an eye on. It's a little bit hard to see everybody here.
And if it's someone hiding behind the pilot, I was going to say you have to come out.
So I was raised Roman Catholic, and I used to go to church a lot when I was a kid. And not so much these days, but I popped in, like a few months ago, just because I had some friends in town, they wanted to go to church, and I noticed that even the parish I used to go to as a child, the number of people there have reduced over the years. And I never really thought about the mindfulness part without the ritual. Do you think that people following Buddhism in the traditional ways will decrease over time and have this more westernized mindfulness type stuff without the ritual will take over?
It's very likely, but what kind of Buddhism will that be? That's what I'm kind of worried about, right? I think the Buddhists would really drastically reduced, simplified, impoverished. So, I was also raised in Catholic tradition, and when we moved from Latin to, to French, to say, right? I mean, the Mass suddenly became totally devoid of any magic, any power. Maybe not totally. I'm sure for some people it's still there. But on the whole, for many people like me, suddenly what might have been still beautiful about the Mass just vanished, as it were. It looks so utterly stupid, empty of content. I'm sorry. I hope I don't, hurt anyone there. But so I think this probably will happen too. No, I scratch that. I didn't mean empty, stupid, and empty. But you know what I mean, right? It has lost a lot of meaning for a lot of people. So the Vatican II, reform, in a sense, had a lot of advantages. I mean, made a lot of progress on some fronts. But on that front, I think, on the front of personal experience and relationship to the church and all that, it has lost much of its power. And of course, nowadays, church is facing much harder, much worse problems, right? But, yeah. So Buddhists might be facing the same kind of problem, I think. I'm not sure. I mean, already, it's, who knows what will happen, right? I mean, things always surprise us, right? So, there might be we might be creating a new form of Buddhism there that, let's say the case with MBSR, as I say, it has really, the problem I have here is the kind of sudden growth and the fact that meditation is very powerful. It has a lot of effects on people, not only good effects, but also negative effects. And there have been experiments showing that, yes, it is really ambivalent. It depends on it's a powerful tool, but it really depends who is using it, right? So it's used to be practiced in a context, you know, with people, surveillance of people who know. Nowadays, suddenly, with massive, you know, increase of practitioners, the practitioners become masters overnight almost, right? And there you have no clue really of what they are doing or how they can really help people, and that's dangerous potentially. So we might go there. We just are in a transition period. So my problem is to say, in a sense, I would agree with Kabat-Zinn and say, you know, basically, if you develop this new form of practice, well, and if it's good, you know, for people, and if you start now kind of fine-tuning it and so on and so forth, yes, why not? But why call it Buddhist, right? You know, Buddhism is something different.
So my name is Ken. I'm the Buddhist Pure Land chaplain here at the university, and I teach at the Calgary Buddhist Temple. So to sort of speak to some of that and your talk, our normal Sunday services are traditional and Buddhist with ritual, but they're also contemporary in message, because a lot of people who come to our temple are looking not so much for Buddhism as identity, if you will. Mm-hmm. So although we are of a Japanese lineage and the rituals that we follow are of a Japanese background, our probably 80% of a normal Sunday looks like this audience here that comes, and they're looking for a message sometimes of hope in the world. That's our Sunday services, but as a temple, we offer things such as mindfulness meditation, drop-in meditation, and other on-ramps. And the way I sort of view that is rather than offering Olympic bobsledding, people sometimes just want to slide down the mountain on a piece of cardboard. And then you might buy a sled.
It's a nice metaphor.
Right? I use a metaphor probably too frequently. I call it my baby metaphor about mindfulness. Mindfulness says, it's more complex than this, but mindfulness might say, oh look, there's a baby crawling in the street in traffic. John Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as paying attention on purpose without judgment. So mindfulness says, oh, there's a baby. But you need to develop something we would call discernment or wisdom that says a baby in traffic is wrong. And then maybe you need to expand on that and develop compassion, which says, even at risk to myself, I'll go rescue the baby.
Okay,
So that qualia is what's important.
Yeah, do you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to, in alignment with what you were saying, the qualia beyond the scientific research that just says this is the measurement is what turns us into human beings and Buddhists.
Right. I totally agree with what you said. And that's the thing. Reducing mindfulness to just a technique, you know, a neutral technique without a context of morality, right, and wisdom. And as you know, I mean, as Purser and others have shown, it's being used nowadays in the army. You know, it's good for sniper. If you can really be aware of what's going on, you become a good sniper, right? And then you say, oh, wait a minute, you know, is that Buddhist? And then you say, oh, we don't need to be Buddhist, right? It's just mindfulness. Okay, then there's a real problem. I totally agree. Now, I want to return to the first part of your comments on how Buddhism would evolve, you know, and that's what you are doing in this world. Now, Pure Land Buddhism, as you know, most of you probably know, it's a form of Buddhism I didn't mention. It's really not really mentioned by neo-Buddhists. No, most Pure Land Buddhists are really ethnic Buddhists, if I might say, right? Japanese, I mean, many of them anyway. And it's a belief in a belief in the Buddha, Amida, who will become to save us, right, at the time of death, and take us to this Western Pure Land. So it rings to a Catholic, of course. It has some. You might feel some affinities. What I'm saying is that it's a form of Buddhism that is totally, not totally, but anyway, certainly pushed aside by neo-Buddhism, which wants just pure meditation without any mythology. Who needs Buddha Amida? Who needs Buddha for that matter, right? So you are, in a sense, the exception to the rule of modern Buddhists or Buddhist modernists. You are trying to develop a modern Buddhism that still continues the ancient tradition. And as I say, I suppose you have more success when you talk about mindfulness, you might have success with the Westerners, but when you talk about Amida, you probably have more success with traditional Buddhists. Or
we're actually examining what the idea of Amida means too in that context. Hold
right.
on here, but it's definitely not the idea of traditional Asian of spiritual being that embraces you to save you. It's more of a reflection of your Buddha nature, perhaps.
Yeah, so that already happened, let's say in China and Japan. There was Shinran definitely is the one who did that. And that was one trend of Amidis, which some say really went,
We follow Shinran.
Right, yes, exactly. Yes?
So you mentioned a lot of good explanations of how Buddhism has been corporatized and in that type of realm. But then, I guess, what is the positive case for that we need the mythology? So I get that it might take away from the mythology, and your example of the Dalai Lama was almost ready to abandon the cosmology. But why, I guess, is that a problem? Like, what does the mythology and the metaphysics of it bring to us?
Well, yes, it's a good question. Now, well, my point here is that they are really intertwined. And it's easy to say, oh, let's drop that's cosmological and let's keep what's meditation. But when you look at the Buddhist texts, through meditation, you reach certain levels of states of mind, and these states of mind are correlated with cosmological states, which mean that actually you will be reborn on one of the states of cosmology. Well, that's just one example among others. But what I'm trying to say is simply that the cosmology is not some modular part that you can just get rid of and keep the rest untouched. No, if you remove it, you change the whole dynamics, the whole balance of a very fragile, let's say, ecosystem, right? So that was my point.
So does the cosmology get us anything? Does it make our life more fulfilling? Does it lead to deeper understanding? Does it have some
Do you
kind
need
of
love?
What?
Do you need love?
I mean,
So that's a qualia. That's
Let's be sure.
No, but yeah. Well, okay, getting back to the earlier question, and here again we have, let's say, the traditional Pure Land. Well, there are two traditions in Pure Land, right? There's Jodo Shu and Jodo Shinshu, and the master and the disciple, Honen and Shinran. Okay, but they are still one in many respects. Now, if you want to be a believer in that form of Buddhism and you deny entirely the reality of the Pure Land, what remains? In other words, the Pure Land here acts from the point of view of faith, this notion of faith, right? The faith, you need to have faith in someone, right? A Buddha. It could be the so-called historical Buddha. You need to have faith that what he did was right and he really did reach the state of mind and awakening he did, so that you can now emulate him, or you can believe in another Buddha like Amida who will save you, right? If you don't believe in any of this because it's just mythology, what do you have? You have just a technique. Well, why don't you go practice yoga or anything else, right? It doesn't have to be Buddhist. It's just a method of relaxation, but it doesn't lead you anywhere, because the somewhere it was supposed to lead you, you have somehow excised because you knew better. Right? So I'm saying when you do that, you really impoverish the tradition, and you are left with a kind of lifeless, maybe not lifeless, but anyway, much awakened, much impoverished form of Buddhism. And the goal of Buddhism, so in all this discourse about meditation, mindfulness, first, let's put this, let's be clear about this. Mindfulness is presented now as a kind of panacea of all, right? But mindfulness is just a basic preliminary form of meditation. It's not even entering the door, it's a threshold, according to the Buddhist tradition. So it doesn't lead you, if it leads to happiness, good, but happiness there, as I say, is not, it's not really being somewhere good. You are not saved by this kind of state of mind. It was supposed simply to introduce you to a higher form of meditation, much longer, much more hard. Why would people practice the whole lifetime? If what you reach, you can reach in 8 weeks of mindfulness, right? No one would do that, right? What happened to all these people? The generation after generation of Asian Buddhists, have they wasted their life, that time, believing in total, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, right? At least we must leave them the benefit of the doubt, thinking, if you lived in Asia, those people are really smart, and I've been spending, a good part of my life in Asia, and I've met people there whom I must say, really I admire, right? And I would say, I know nothing and they know much more. And they practice this form of practice. So I'm sure that, I can trust them that they found something there. They are not, you also get crooks, of course. You get all kinds of false gurus. And in the West, it's really hard to distinguish who would be a false from a true guru, right? We have seen so many cases of those, right, in the past 40 years. So we don't have the right criteria, precisely because we're not part of this tradition. We're like innocent, right? And innocent in negative sense, right? And so what I'm saying is that from this position of innocence, in other words, of knowing nothing almost, that we should decide this is right and I can get rid of this and get rid of that. This may be going too fast. Now my problem is when the Dalai Lama, who is not in this position, he's supposedly in much advanced position, is saying that, because it's like he's sowing the branch on which he's been sitting, right? Because without cosmology, there would be no Dalai Lama. Who is the Dalai Lama? He's a reincarnation of past lamas. He's also a manifestation of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. Now, if you have no cosmology, all this falls apart, right? And the Dalai Lama is just another guy. No reason to give him any particular attention. He's a very nice person, but you find a lot of nice persons, in the world. So you believe in him somehow because already you are accepting the kind of cosmology behind the whole system. You cannot take this in the system and really, it's my point anyway. I might be wrong here. Yes.
Bring us back to the neuroscience part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've talked about the Western neuroscience and the imaging and the paradigm that Western medicine has as far as what is connected in the brain to various behaviors or abilities like gross motor, fine motor skills, or compassion. Given that Buddhism is traditionally Eastern based with East Asia, is there anything within the East Asian medical philosophies? They've got the yin yang, the energy chi, that kind of thing that is not Western. It's a different paradigm. Is there anything within that model that has looked at meditation and the effect on monks or on the human brain or energy pathways or anything like that?
That's a good question. I don't know if I cannot really answer it, but yes. So the fact is, the Westerners, the neuroscientists have been suddenly amazed that somehow meditation works, right? Because for a long time they thought this is just baloney, right? And then now finally, so they're looking at with some of them who are become Buddhists, and so they look for a rational justification, a proof that somehow, and they're finding something. They're going to fast in saying we found a lot. Let me here open a parenthesis. A neuroscientist at Brown some time ago, a group of neuroscientists founded by some high institution, the medical and all that, did a meta-study of the Buddhist claims, the neuroscientific experiments on Buddhism over the past 10, 15 years. And these people, and some of them are, as I say, practitioners, neuroscientists and practitioners, so they are really invested actually, but still objective there, right? So they define a number of protocols, a number of criteria to show what is really valid experiment, and that would reassure us that that was the case. Out of 18,000 studies, papers right, and all that, published over the past 10, 15 years. 18,000 has been, of course, a plethora, right? They found that 47 met their scientific criteria. 47 out of 18,000. Now, that doesn't mean that all the others were wrong, maybe like Ricard, the French philosopher, the French practitioner I mentioned, but he's only one. There's no control groups. You cannot reproduce that experiment on the basis of one person. You always need a control group, right? And there was no control group. Reaching such incredibly, strong result on the basis of one person, everyone should have laughed, right? They didn't. They took it and ran with it, and made it, the big, the first front page of many scientific journals. So that's a problem, that many of these experiments are kind of problematic. Now, in the case of to get back to your question then, my point was that for any Asian scientist, there's no need, I think, to prove that acupuncture works or meditation works. They know it. They don't even have to do experiments about it. It's only surprising for a Westerner, for Western scientists who say, "Oh my God, of course it works." I mean, I think the fact of practicing 10,000 hours of meditation having an effect on your brain. I mean, you don't need to have, drinking coffee for 10,000 hours or whatever, for a long time would also has a lot of neural correlates, right? Everything has neural correlates. The question is, what do they neural correlate means, right? So if I find out that my drinking coffee increases my frontal cortex and lead me to happiness, is this going to be the front page of the newspapers tomorrow? No, right? But if it's meditation, yes. And what is different, right? Why do you want? So there's this kind of confirmation bias in all this, many of these experiments, and the Asians don't need that. I mean, I think. Although I must say, I did a version of, slightly different version of this talk last year in Hangzhou, in the Zhejiang University in China, and it's a center of Buddhist studies affiliated with neuroscience, and they were not happy to hear me saying that. Actually, they were quite unhappy, I would say. So even in Asia, you would find people who have this kind of but these people are also very often very westernized. They study in the West, right? They study at Calgary, technology and whatever, right? And they go back to China and they bring the Western conception of things. But otherwise, someone who is really into Chinese medicine and wouldn't have a problem with meditation. Yeah, it doesn't need to. Josh, yeah.
I think your talk really nicely identifies a tension, and this tension is that the popular practice of mindfulness in some way leads to an effort to naturalize Buddhism. So my question is, at what point is this practice no longer Buddhism? That's a very broad question, but what would be the irreducibles?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When do you cross the line? Yes. It's hard to say. It's just that, it's blurred, the boundary is blurred there probably, or moving, right? Or so you can say, oh, now, But what you can say that after a while, you are no longer in this area and now you are in the other. So you have somehow crossed the line, right? I couldn't say more there. I don't know what would be, because again, you need to define a set of criteria and what would they be really, right? I'm not too sure. But as I say, well, maybe the elements I mentioned there, for me, what Buddhism is as a total kind of system includes, as I say, philosophy, of course, practice, meditation, but also mythology and cosmology, right? And I think once you drop any of those, somehow you are already moving toward the other territory. And that's all I think I could say here. You had a question behind it? Yes.
Thank you so much for your research on this. I think it's really important, and I really appreciate that you're taking that seriously.
That you don't know.
Yeah,
soon, yes.
It's really in depth, and encounter mindfulness in the world and the way that people treat it, it's a bit troubling for me as well. So I'm a practitioner in Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition.
Okay.
What's interesting is that in that tradition, we actually have a retreat on neuroscience going on in Plum Village. And it's pretty regular, right?
It's Plum Village in France, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, kind of, it seems like there's this, within some Buddhist traditions, there's this desire to use neuroscience to justify itself.
Right, right.
Right.
And also in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, definitely. And of course, I don't want to, I mean, it would be easy to question the motivation on either side, neuroscience and, and Buddhist, because clearly each one has to gain and also to lose maybe, right, in the process. But I don't want to do this here, but yeah, I see your point.
So, but the other part of it is, I find it really interesting that you were able to look at this and gain the insights that you did, rather than coming to the mindfulness conclusions and just attaching that it is, it is mindfulness, it is neuroscience. But you've actually said that Buddhism has value. I'm wondering, how did you come to that? Like, where was your interest in it? How did you get it?
Yes, well, of course, as I say, I'm not a Buddhist, and yet I am, in a sense. In this way, I have a lot of sympathy for Buddhism. I wouldn't spend 30 years or more of my life studying something if I didn't think it had value, right? So I did practice meditation, Zen meditation, in Japan a long time ago, to get a good sense and what it was and all that. And then basically I'm a historian and also a historian of religions, but I started as a historian. So I looked at tradition, at text, and the history, the evolution of the tradition, and what I see there. I mean, without any preconception really. I started from a kind of philosophical viewpoint. I want to study, like everyone else, basically, and I had read D.T. Suzuki or things like that, I had a certain idea about Zen. And then what I found was really different. What I found in Zen first, in Chan, so that was my first, then what I found in esoteric Buddhism, really different. It doesn't make sense from, I had to change my ideas. And I did, right? So it's not I wanted to be, I was not there from the start. It's not I wanted to be there. It was against my own desire, in a sense. So now back to Thich Nhat Hanh. I read the other day, some account on the Plum Village, and I admire him as a person. I mean, he really radiates, empathy and I don't know, a lot of virtue that I could read, that are really impressive, The same thing with the Dalai Lama, even maybe more in a sense. And yet, it was describing the practice. So he is really a Chan or Zen Vietnamese monk, right? He belongs to the Chan tradition, which is very iconoclastic, very, as we know, right? Very rough. I mean, exactly the opposite. The Chan tradition creates people who are just exactly very different from Thich Nhat Hanh as persons. They tend to be rough and right. And so the practice there was to say, it's a bit like a Protestant church almost. Turn to your neighbors and hug, and hug and say, I love you, I love you, I love you, and say, well, okay, that might good. It feels good, and it really maybe helps you to feel empathy for the other person. But that has really nothing, as far as I can tell, nothing to do with the Chan tradition. So in a sense, the engaged Buddhism of Thich Nhat Hanh is a form of, he's one of the people who can really launch this neo-Buddhism, engaged Buddhism. And it's like the MBSR. It has a lot of powerful and positive effects. And it's believed to be, just like in the case of Dalai Lama, to be traditional, because these two people are monks in their own tradition. But basically they have departed so much from their tradition, that what they propose to me is a new religion.
I think, so being a part of that tradition, just to sort of switch that around, I think that it is sold that way, but how it's actually practiced is a different thing. If you're
Okay. Yeah. Well, you know better than me. I'm just, relying on this and say, that call it that charm? Yeah, no way. Yes. There's one question over there and one question over there, as far as I can see. Ladies first. Ladies first, you go first. And then the two. Yeah, it's the French way.
Hi, I'm from Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm a psychologist. I'm teaching counseling psychology at UC. And growing up in a Buddhist household, mindfulness, meditation kind of thing was kind of part of daily thing. And when studying psychology and mindfulness started to get really big, I kind of welcomed it. But at the same time, when I tried to publish a paper on Buddhist psychology, I was told that the citation that I used, religious, scholarship in Japanese is not good.
Mm-hmm.
You have to cite Kabat-Jin.
Right.
And at the same time, postdoc students from Japan are coming to study mindfulness
Here.
in the States to bring back mindfulness
Right.
in Japan. And I'm just, and it's mindfulness is huge in Japan right now.
Of course, yes.
I'm just wondering, in addition to, characterization, naturalization, and secularization of Buddhism, is there neo-colonization happening here? And
Is there, sorry?
Neo-colonization that's happening.
Neo-colonization
That
is what I heard.
the
Yeah.
source of credibility has to come from the West rather than.
In that sense, yes, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the Zen tradition, right, it was brought to the West by D.T. Suzuki, and now the Japanese are. And Suzuki was a Pure person actually. He was not a Zen. I mean, he knew about Zen. He practiced some, but he was really in another tradition. And it has been brought back to Japan, and now people are reading D.T. Suzuki as the Bible of Zen, right? So same phenomenon, so-called pizza effect, right, in a sense. So yes, it is colonizing pretty much everywhere. As I mentioned, China, so Japan too, of course. And Japanese, as you know, are really eager to absorb anything that comes from the West, right? But the thing is, you do still have in Japan a tradition that is still there and alive, except that it doesn't have the same kind of appeal to young Japanese, than this new form, because they are new and because they are westernized, right? So, but these old traditions have lived for a long time. They have survived. They are still here, right? They're also changing, adapting to some extent. So the story is not over, right? I mean, what we do on the other hand, mindfulness could be there to last, or it could be just a fashion that will disappear as quickly as it has appeared, right? Or at least will kind of become much more constrained or realistic as time goes on. Because it's being said, you see the image we saw, like, practice meditation to find, okay, let's forget happiness, but well-being, relaxation, right? Well, meditation does just the opposite. If you practice meditation, I gave a talk like that, and I had at the end of the talk a young woman in Geneva come to me and said, I'm a bipolar, and I was told to practice meditation to relax, and it increased my problems 10 times, It's like, it's not what I need. It's because, yes, you lose sleep if you practice. Yeah, awareness, of course, we should know that, right? So instead of finding sleep or relaxation, you find insomnia or things like that. And all that comes with it. So it has effects, but not exactly the effects we are told it supposedly has. And once people really figure out the negative, the effects, positive or negative, but also sometimes the negative effects, like the Chan monks, Zen monks, they knew. In the 6th century, there was books written about Chan meditation illness, right? Meditation disease. People getting kind of crazy. People having psychological problems. It was very well perceived. No one tells you this in MBSR. But when you start looking, and again, the neuroscientists I mentioned, they have started looking at these things because they had themselves negative experiences. So they started wondering and went from Zen center or Buddhist centers here and there, asking, and find out that, yes, there's a lot of that, a lot of negative, side effects. And a lot of people are left with, sometimes with very severe, actually, psychological effects. And those is, again, the confirmation bias I was mentioning before. We don't look at those, we look only at the positive effects, and we report only on those. Once finally this will be known better, then we'll get a more realistic, more fine-tuned, practice of mindfulness, and maybe then some people will benefit and others will do other things, But to present it as a kind of Prozac of the mind, that's clearly mistaken, and yet somehow it's what has happened. So, did I answer your question or no? Okay. So you have okay.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to ask, what kind of evidence do you have that the trends that you've noticed, commercialization, technology, science? I'd like to ask, what kind of evidence that you have that the trends that you've noted, commercialization, science, technology, have affected what I would call the core of Buddhism? So you talk about the tradition, we'll identify that with the core.
I cannot do that, but could you?
I beg your pardon?
I cannot identify the core, but could you?
Yeah, what you call tradition.
Yeah, right.
So, for example, we have, within East Asia and Southeast Asia, we have the carrying on through the monasteries, but even the monasteries in Calgary, the Avansantaka monastery, I will find them to be very traditional. For example, they keep nuns and monks separate. So at one time it was monks within the monastery or the temple, and now it's only nuns. So there's a tradition there. This is one example. So I'm wondering, is what we're noted, and you mentioned the Dalai Lama, but apart from that, the pictures of the monks with their iPhones or iPads, which I can understand, maybe what we're looking at is a fad, a phase that people on the fringe are adopting, whereas the core is still retaining some of the things that you value, mythology and the cosmology and such. So my question goes back to you, what kind of evidence do you have that the core, the tradition, is being affected?
All right, but you see, you use two different words here, and I don't think they mean the same thing. The core and the tradition. Now, there are many Buddhist traditions, and they disagree on almost everything. But is there a core of Buddhism? Maybe there is, but I don't see it really. You might. What do you see as a core yourself? Do you have any idea of what that would be?
So let's try the tradition. I'm looking for an interpretation, I think, from your point. I think you noticed the fringe, but I'm thinking of there is a tradition there.
No, I get that.
That one I'm wondering is just changing as much as we would probably worry about given the content of your speech today, your presentation.
Yes, right. But again, there's not one tradition. There are traditions in the plural, and they are very different. Between a Zen monk and a Shinto monk, there would, of course, the outside, the paraphernalia, if you like, the institution would look very much the same. Monks and nuns, ritual, and so on. But the content of the ritual, the content of the practice, the content of the dogma, the philosophy would be very different. So people usually tell you, like in Western Buddhism, the core of Buddhism, we know what the core of Buddhism was. And that core, actually, these Asians had forgotten about it, right? But now we can go back to it. What is it? The historical Buddha, put quotation mark, I just wrote a book on the Buddha, showing that really we don't know much about the Buddha except legends. So there might have been someone who lived and practiced and found out, but basically what we know about him is just legends. But in any case, so the Buddha found enlightenment and he promulgated the so-called Four Noble Truths. And that for most people would be the core Buddhist that every Buddhist would agree on. Now the historian looks at the text and he sees that actually it's interesting. The first accounts of the enlightenment of a Buddha don't mention the so-called Four Noble Truths. That comes out much later. So, of course, it's still very early on, early Buddhism. You can find it very early on. But was that the teaching of the Buddha? That could be argued. But even so, these 4 Buddhist truths were relatively simple. Life is suffering. Well, any Indian of that time would agree with that. And actually, probably any Indian nowadays. I mean, when you look at the conditions of life in India, except the higher class maybe. But so there is suffering, and he found that the source of suffering was desire, right, or craving, right? And again, that's very pan-Indian. Every Indian would probably agree with that. Where it differed was to say, there is an end to that, and that end I call nirvana. Now, again, the Buddhists have been really arguing a lot after he passed into nirvana himself, into extinction. What did that mean? And they come with totally opposite ideas about what is nirvana. And the Indian Buddhists already do that. Chinese Buddhists go even one step further, putting the whole thing on its head, as it were. The Mahayana Buddhists completely inverted many of the ideas you find in early Buddhism, right? So that's the third noble truth. The first noble truth is so-called the Eightfold Path, morality and so on, meditation. Well, basically reduced to 3. Concentration or meditation. Well, first morality, concentration, meditation, and wisdom. Here again, I think there's nothing really so specific about it. So, what is core Buddhism then? I don't know, frankly. But I can tell you on any example, you will tell me any definition of the core, I would find really easily counterexamples. For example, so-called no self. Well, that was really important, right? The notion of there is no self. And there is karma. Well, now, how do you put no self and karma together? If there's no one there, who cares about what will happen in the future to this no one, right? So there was a real problem there. And the Buddhists were fighting to reconcile the no-self notion, anatman, which was really a way to demarcate yourself from the Hindus, and the notion of karma, which was really pretty much what every Indian would also accept. No self. Well, at the time of the Buddha, as we told, there was one school of Buddhists would claim that's called the Pudgala, there is a self. And people have said, oh, but they were really like little heterodox guys. Now historians are showing, actually, no, it was quite a powerful, really mainstream form of Buddhism. So even the notion of no self, which everyone would think, that's core Buddhism. Well, no. And then you go to the Zen tradition where they take you about the greater self, as opposed to little self. Well, suddenly you have a self again, which looks very much like the self of the Indian, of the Vedanta or other things. So I'm embarrassed with the notion of core Buddhism. I don't find it. Buddhist tradition, in the plural, yes. But that's very superficial in a sense, right? Let me give you one further example to this. Zen about Buddhism about meditation, in particular Zen. And then the name Zen means meditation, dhyana. So everyone thinks Zen is about meditation. When I started practicing meditation, this is a kind of personal account here, during a session, a 7-day intensive period, right? So we get up at 3:30 in the morning, and we go to the abbot's room, and for 2 hours, excruciatingly painful hours, sitting on kneeling on a tatami. I mean, if you ever tried that, it's worse than sitting meditation. We listen to the long list of patriarchs, from the Buddha down to the Chinese patriarchs, Indian patriarch, Chinese patriarch, down to the present abbot, And then I had even before practicing any meditation, I had my little enlightenment there. Say, anything you do at 3 in the morning is important. So I started realizing this notion of tradition as an unbroken transmission from the Buddha down to the present is really what differentiates Zen, in particular, from other schools. But then, of course, other schools came to adopt the same idea. Patriarchal tradition, a transmission from patriarch to patriarch. Now, this is not something you will hear about, Buddhism in the West, where you say, oh no, you just sit on your butt for 2 hours or for half an hour every morning before going to work, and you are going to find happiness. Very different, right? So, but that's the Zen tradition. It's very important, you're right, but they differ. There are many of them. And the core Zen, the core Buddhism, I don't find it anywhere. I mean, I found several cores, but they are not in harmony with each other. Or,
Well, sorry, Lloyd.
Okay, yeah.
we can maybe discuss this afterwards. You know, if,
But let's continue the discussion. We have all this great nibbles back here and drinks, and so maybe we can continue the discussion.
thank you. Thank you all.